Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Eric Jenkins. I'm the account manager for Connecting Up in TechSoup New Zealand. Connecting Up is part of the Info Exchange Group, and Info Exchange is a not-for-profit social enterprise that has delivered technology for social justice for over 25 years. With over 100 staff across Australia and New Zealand, we tackle the biggest social challenges through the smart and creative use of technology. Today, I would love to welcome you to the webinar Back to Basics Event Management Technology, which is being presented by Tal Merritz of Preevent. We'll start with just a little bit of housekeeping here. All the lines are going to be muted, so if you've got any technical issues, please just type it in the questions box on your webinar panel, and I'll do my best to help you troubleshoot that. If you've got any questions during the session, please also put that in the questions box. Tal will be tackling questions at the end of the webinar, so there will be a bit of time for Q&A at the end. So please, if you've got questions, please send it through. We'd love to get those. Do note that your comments and questions won't appear to the entire group, though. They'll just be appearing to me. If you're on a Wi-Fi connection and have multiple programs open, that can sometimes affect the quality of the audio and video of the webinar. So if possible, just shut down programs you're not using just to have the best experience you possibly can today. Do note this webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording and the slide deck will be sent to you shortly, probably later this week, it's looking like at this stage. So do keep an eye out on your inbox for that. Otherwise, I'd also like to remind you there will be a short survey at the end of the webinar, so we'd appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to give us a bit of feedback. Otherwise, that's it for me. So Tal, over to you now.
Fantastic. All right, let's get started. So I think as you've already, done a good start there, definitely do want to hear questions throughout that we'll chat about afterwards and all that kind of thing. So let's get started. So a little bit about me. I'm from Preevent, we're an event management technology company. I'm sure some of you have read a little bit about that, and obviously we might cover a few things while we talk about these things, and obviously worked with a wide range of all kinds of organizations, all the way from that government level, corporate level. But of course, sometimes this one I call a bit of the scary slide. It's especially when sometimes we're talking about not-for-profits and things like that, and sometimes people get the impression that maybe these things aren't for not-for-profits, but that is certainly not the case at all. In fact, in many respects, especially when we're talking about events, events are really the kind of thing that often is far more important and far more high value and essential to a not-for-profit than it is to many other types of organizations. That's definitely very happy to be a part of this today. So a bit about what we'll chat about today. We'll get a bit of an overview of event technology as a whole, what that involves, what that means. But then we'll also look more specifically at how that affects both attendees and planners. So looking through the journey of an attendee when it comes to an event, the experience they go through and how that changes when we introduce that kind of technology, as well as how it affects the experience for planners as well. Obviously, there's two sides to that. All right, so quick overview, I guess, of what we would call technology. It's one thing to just have certain, tech-based solutions in place, but this is what most of us is what we would call a point solution, right? So when someone says, oh, I've got event technology because I have something for my registration, or I've got a website, right? A lot of these things we'd really call point solutions. And really where we're really getting into a full event technology almost platform is once you're getting to that level where we're actually not just, we're simplifying and actually integrating and automating all of those processes together, whether or not they be things that you've previously been doing via various manual processes and Excel spreadsheets, but also some of those other tech solutions that you might have in place separated, and bring it all together so you have that essentially single source of truth when it comes to executing these events. All right, but let's, and I guess as part of this is it's also talking about all levels of an event, right? So again, I think a lot of people probably focus on very particular parts, and they might say, again, as I said, yes, registration, right? That makes sense. But there's all levels to an event and all levels in which these solutions should be coming in place, right? So you have that base of an event where we start talking about your budgeting, finding venues, obviously payments, right? These are all the classic things as part of an organizing of an event. But of course, on the day itself, you also start to have all of those experiences, both for attendees, but also the organization for you as planners on the day. And then the big part that I think a lot of people often forget afterwards is actually getting a bit of an analysis post-event, right? All these people have come, had all kinds of interactions, we've had so many goals to do with putting on these events in the first place. And do we have a way to actually track and evaluate the entire process? That's where tech comes through on every level here to actually execute that. What I would say to start with is the overarching, and as part of that idea of having insights, that final level of post-event, how did things go? Preevent does a lot of research into what's facing planners, their challenges, how they're doing, what their plans are, what the future's going to be. But like I said, just getting a better idea of the challenges that are facing planners. And we find overwhelmingly that when we ask and we survey questions about what planners really know about their attendees, we get pretty mixed results, right? So when we know it seems obvious to say, what do attendees do at our events? And, it's fairly middling. A lot seem to do that it goes very well or extremely well, or certainly at least well, which is I call, a bit of a not too great, not too bad. But I think often when we dig into the details, I think a lot of people, when we ask them again, they start down ranking themselves more and more. So we can play actually a bit of a game with this one. If we take a look at this is the classic attendee journey that you might have. This is maybe at a conference, right? So this is where there's a bit more involved, but there might be a little less involved. It's something smaller, some kind of luncheon or seminar. That might be something larger at some kind of giant expo, but the principles underlying are ultimately the same. Of that, you have your pre-event journey, that whole process of, before they even arrive, giving details, even the marketing that's happened leading up to the event. Obviously, during the event itself, there's all kinds of places they go, do, talk to, speak to, listen to things. And of course, post-event, there's always that communication as well. And it's worth thinking, because we'll actually walk through these essentially in order of how well do you think you know what your attendees are doing. So we'll start with the pre-event side of things. Most organizations are not necessarily tracking these things, but when we introduce that tech in there, it's worth noting the way we can really transform. Of course, the classic way is people just send emails, but we always want to try and change that journey to be one where we can have more of an email marketing, email campaign. Again, obviously our large corporations have specialized software to facilitate this. But of course, this is becoming increasingly common amongst not-for-profits and associations as well. We're realizing that, essentially employing someone to constantly manually send out emails when this is something that can be, a large portion of which can be facilitated, makes an enormous difference. That experience that they get from someone getting these emails, the classic example being that actually directly comes from a person, even though it's been part of this software, right? So it doesn't feel like I'm getting some mass email. It's still personalized to me, personalized to my information. Certainly makes a big difference, both for the attendee, but of course saves a lot of time for planners as well. Probably, I think, though, the part where at this point people are the most advanced, I think, these days is at their registration. I think probably at this point, most organizations are using some kind of online registration. At this point, we don't have too many people still going for the papers, or at least if they have the paper, it's only part of an emergency. But I think what's still often missing for a lot of organizations is that they're failing to essentially brand out these processes, right? So it's that next stage of, for an attendee leading up to the event, being able to get those personalized invitations that take them to that next level of branding that really show off, why should I be coming? What's exciting about this event? What am I going to be finding out about? But like I said, these are the things that probably most people cover the most. However, I think probably the area which is probably most missing, I would almost say, is that there's that huge gap between the registration leading up to an event, but then of course there's that check-in on the day. And there's a huge gap that usually goes on between that. And this is that first area where I say, well, how well do we really know our attendees and how they've been traveling around our event. A lot of people can look at their registration list, but certainly when we chat to a lot of people, most people are tracking attendance by saying, well, I printed out the lanyards and whatever lanyards are left over afterwards, I guess those are the people that didn't come. But there's certainly a lot better ways to get that much better insight, and a lot of systems in place these days for actually be checking in attendees, being able to handle if it's a different person that showed up to the person that was originally intending to come, still having a personalized badging for all of them. And as you can see here, we're really even getting to points now where some of your VIPs are showing up, your major sponsors, things like that, being able to have the planner informed that person has arrived, let's say a speaker, as opposed to having either standing there yourself or having a runner that has to come to you and say, oh no, our major speaker has come. Can you run down and shake their hand? We've certainly reached a different level at this point of that kind of communication and personalization. Right, but all of that is really just leading up to the event itself. There's a whole world, of course, probably the current process for understanding what people are doing for attendees is really just looking around on the day, right? How do we know what booths people went to and exhibitors? Well, we stand on the booth floor and kind of go, okay, this exhibitor seems to get a lot of attention. How do we know who they've been meeting with or anything like that? Well, usually, to be honest, we don't know at the time. We're probably only relying on the survey data afterwards. But these days, there really is a lot of tech that can enable this. And a big part of that is just because of that, obviously, that popularity of our phones and our devices. I won't labor this point. I'm sure anyone that reads, any kind of social media post or paper, people decrying the end of civilization a lot of the time due to our obsession with tech. But the reality is look, people use their phones a lot. They look at some kind of screen these days, and this is just, this is outside of work. Outside of work hours, we're talking, these days we're getting to now 5 hours and above for the average person. And as you can see, actual touch points of people checking their phone is just thousands of times. It's getting quite ridiculous. But at the same time, it doesn't make much sense to try and get away from that. This is what your attendees are doing anyway. So do we want to try and put our head in the sand and allow them to essentially disengage from our event? Well, we have always found that it probably makes more sense to have places to engage with your event where your attendees are actually going. Right? So they're at their event, but sometimes their mind is in their phone and in their screen. This is probably then where you should be placing places to help direct them, grab their attention. I'm sure some people have used event apps before, seen them before. It's a huge developing area, continuing to be. Some people might not be familiar, but the ultimate summary of the way these work is that that engagement and networking, those core parts of why people come to an event, these are built up from the ground up to help facilitate. So, there's all kinds of icons that we can look at here, but if you think about being able to have that personalized schedule, I can't really get people to raise their hands here. I can't see everyone that's watching, but I'd be impressed if any of you could say that with a large conference or something like that their schedule has ever been correct all throughout the day and has never needed any last second changes. Certainly for us, it's just never the case. That's the reality of events. And so being able to have personalized schedules for attendees that are even able to update on the fly right in their palm of their hand according to when those different things happen on the day, that obviously makes a huge difference. And that's a big part of where that value really lies. I might actually take a bit of a step back because there's just so many things that these apps can do. And, I actually started originally in Preevent on the apps team, and I don't intend to harp on about these for hours and hours. So that would, I think, make all of us suffer a little. But I did want to at least point out some of the research that we've put into the priorities when it comes to these apps. So we've done some research, partnered with a group called Event Marketer, where we surveyed both attendees and event professionals in terms of what their top priorities, values are when it came to these apps. And that helps inform, as an industry, what we develop into. But I think probably the biggest thing that we found, coming back to this issue of attendee footprints, is that we found that overwhelmingly planners are struggling to, track and really understand what their attendees are doing. This is a good example of where early on, it was over 50% that seemed to say that they were at least somewhat effective at knowing what their attendees are doing at their events. And yet when we ask this question a bit differently and we use terms like tracking and footprint, some of the more data-based sounding type questions, I think suddenly the truth somewhat comes out, and we find actually most planners are happy to somewhat admit actually we don't have that much of an idea of about what people are doing. But that's where this kind of tech comes in. So if we take a look at these apps and some of the top priorities, there's quite a lot here. I'm gonna break this down somewhat. It's quite interesting to see, I think, what planners in particular value the most out of their apps. To me, some of the ones that I've always found, if we jump into actually some of these, taking a look at some of those top priorities, I think a lot of these make sense, right? So planners appreciate that attendees, they want the messaging, networking, right? Networking is a huge part of our events. I think it definitely makes sense that they value that. Obviously the branding, things like that. Push notifications is something very, very popular. Of course, it's fun to be able to blast your attendees with messages, but it's surprising at the same time to see the things that planners maybe are currently not valuing. And I think it's something to keep in mind, right? We look at things like surveys, right? Surveys don't seem to be a particularly high value item, even though at the same time, I find, almost every planner is always concerned about their low survey response rates, always want to more accurate, even I'm sure after this, we've even said here that people should be filling out the surveys. How do they find the events? And yet when it comes to their actual apps, people say, oh, I don't need to survey data. That's quite concerning, especially as some of the other research has shown that it's about 103% increase from survey response rates when they're live in an app, when someone can respond at the time. If you're waiting till afterwards, it just drops. The other part I'm surprised as well is always that planners don't seem to currently be too concerned about their sponsorship banners and things like that. So they worry about branding. Obviously, that's very important. But things like these sponsor banners are exactly how you pay for these apps and get some of that return on investment. I'm always surprised that that's not a huge thing. And the ones I'll note for now are just the maps and the exhibitor appointments, both of things which I would say are fairly low value, are quite surprising when we compare it to attendees. So when we look at attendees and what their biggest value that they get out of an app, there's a few quite interesting things that we see, right? The number two thing that they want out of their apps, your attendees, are maps and floor plans. It makes sense because they haven't been to the events. They haven't been planning it for months the way you have. They show up. There's all kinds of rooms everywhere. And it makes sense that they find this currently a very frustrating area. And it's obviously quite convenient when you have a map that's able to direct you to exactly where you need to be connected to your schedule. Right? So that's one that I would probably say is a large surprise, where I think probably we should be recognizing a little more that our attendees are looking for that kind of direction. But the other part I would note as well is the exhibitor appointments. So I won't harp on about these too much, but I guess the short summary being that the ability to not just have a personalized schedule in terms of what sessions I'm going to, but also a personalized schedule in terms of what meetings I have. Let's say with your exhibitors, sponsors, things like that. This is ranked even lower when it comes to planners. It's ranked extremely low. And I wouldn't exactly say that this is, certainly top 10 is not where this is. But once you factor in the fact that the vast majority of events don't have exhibitors, you realize that this is only as high as it is because so many of our planners are demanding it, right? Sorry, so many of our attendees. So many of our attendees who are going to events with exhibitors are demanding it, that it's pushing it up to the, one of the on the higher end, even though this probably should be in the bottom 6 otherwise, if it was more accurately reflecting the percentage of events that actually had exhibitors. So this is something that I would also note, that clearly we have an element here where more of our attendees are saying, well, I actually want a way to be able to book appointments, get in front of people. And of course, that makes sense. It's a major part of really the networking. It's their essentially corporate or business-based networking, and it makes sense that they would demand that. On the other hand, push notifications, one of the lowest things attendees, it seems so far, can't stand them, which is unfortunate because, of course, planners really like them. But I'm not too concerned about that. I think probably that says more than anything is that we have to look back to, well, if attendees really want better scheduling, more floor plans, things like that, well, then that probably lets us know how we should be using these push notifications. General blasting of random information clearly isn't being received so well, whereas if we help direct attendees according to what they're actually looking for and actually demanding, that's always going to go a long way. Good example of the push notifications, but the point there being is that there's so much forms of communication, directing that we can do here. Here's an example of some of the maps that, of course, go a long way and clearly attendees quite enjoy. But as I said, just your general schedule is just one step of, do we know where our attendees are going? As I said, these days, especially when it comes to exhibitors, sponsors, there's always going to be people traveling, talking to people. This is essentially part of the game of how well do we know our attendees, right? Who is speaking to who is often something that a lot of people just aren't aware of right now. This is again coming back to things like these apps go a long way of getting a better idea of what our attendee footprint is. Part of that being as well is that, of course, these days we can even track sessions. I think this is probably another part which some people are on top of, some people are not. Of course, we always don't want to necessarily delay people as people travel around, but there's certainly a lot of methods to really get a better insight into what sessions are going well, what sessions are not. If people are actually required to go to certain sessions, you certainly probably want to check that people are actually going. It certainly goes a long way of getting a better understanding of what your attendee is really doing on the day. Right. But what about post-event? Right. That's post-event itself. Yes, you can take feedback through things like apps at the time on the day. That certainly goes a long way. But it's often about having an extra value, an extra level there of rather than just simply asking people questions. Certainly, I think we probably need to get away from the paper schedules. The paper surveys. They take a huge amount of time, and the data is not often very accurate or all those kinds of things. But being able to get I'll step back. Being able to get much more digital level here, seeing these things much faster, you get much more accurate things from your attendees themselves, often live as well, which means you actually get to see this information, on the day itself or by the end of the first day, as opposed to only waiting to receive the feedback after the end of the event when it's too late to change this one and you have to wait till next year. Or certainly goes a long way. But that's the process for your attendees, right? These are just the touch points for them, but there's certainly so much more, and this is where it's almost embarrassing to do a quick overview like this one. There's just so much potential tech out there that can be covered. This is really only just getting to the start of it, but there's so many steps before, right? Finding your venues is a great example of just something where I think probably right now so many people either just know someone, hire someone, or just have to Google. But there are actually much more specialized ways to really go through, negotiate, find the exact venues. Because it's a pretty classic problem, right? I say I need to find something, I need 60, it needs to hold 60 people in this room, but then I need 3 more breakout rooms. It needs to be in Wellington. It can't be more than 35 minutes from the airport. This is just not something that I can really Google, right? But there's a lot of tech in place that can help facilitate a lot of that without having to hire someone from the outside. Of course, website designs, all of these parts, these are all part of your events, right? It's only later that we get to that registration. But even hotel room blocks, this is again something that probably a lot of people are just manually calling everyone. Flights and transport is often not something done as part of people's registration. A lot of people are registering, and then afterwards you have to go through 12 emails back and forth to get all of their details if you're organizing them. And it goes on and on and on. Of course, post-event as I said, it's not just a matter of having the surveys, but actually you being able to collate all of this together, being able to have this in usable formats, and of course things like event budgets. I think probably still a lot of this stuff is all living on Excel spreadsheets, which means of course that when something changes up here about my venue, it's not reflected in here. I have to do it manually every time someone registers. I have to go back, manually enter everything. All of that takes up a lot of time, but also actually as a result, it's quite inaccurate as well. Because the ultimate way that we summarize it is that there's so many touch points that you're always going to have. Right? Some of this is going to be tech-based, or what we call our point solutions. As I said, your registration, some of your emails, some of your marketing, your website, just by definition, is all going to be like that. But then there's going to be some of those other things you're doing manually. Perhaps some of you are doing check-in manually still. Your budgeting is really manual. It just lives on Excel. Things like that. But the ideal situation is you're able to break down all of those parts and essentially turn it into, a single streamlined platform of event technology where you're covering everything. So you have that one source, as I said, that one source of truth. So that when it comes to even all the way back to when you're even just budgeting or planning out events, that you have that same information that's reflecting over for when I'm finding my venues, that when I'm sending out my emails, that it makes sense in terms of what's going on with registration. That if someone changes their registration just beforehand, that's still going to reflect in my check-in process. Perhaps my apps are communicating according to before, during, and after the event, and that all of the data for me is personalized and makes sense, no matter those other changes that have happened both on my end or that have happened for the planners, speakers have changed, attendees, covered all of these things before. And of course, that big part being that if we really want to understand the value of our events, and we really want to understand, as I said, what people are doing, where people are going, what went well, what didn't go well, and also just that proper understanding is, what was worth our investment, what was worth our time, then when everything is pulled together as a single place to be able to report on, that's where a lot of that really, really comes together. And I think that's probably the true value in many respects of adopting this kind of technology. It's not just a matter of automating, but then it's a matter of actually proving or understanding what went well or what didn't go well. So as I said, I think probably right now, a lot of people basically evaluate that by kind of going, well, it felt pretty good, or that didn't seem to go as well as we hoped, but the data isn't there behind them. Right. So I imagine that there'd be quite a lot of questions because there's just so many things that I've essentially had to barrel through. Like I said, we can really talk about even any individual part of any kind of technology for hours. So we'll open it up. But I did want to say, just in terms of Preevent, that we'd always like to chat. We do work with a lot of people in the not-for-profit sector, and certainly we don't just show these things in theory. If you did want to reach out to us, give us a call. Look us up, Preevent. Give us a call, send us an email, something like that. We can always do things like even build out these apps, build out versions of these websites and registrations to really show you or a team how would this look if we were using it. Not rather than just me showing you, pretty pictures of some demos. We can really show it into, well, what if we were to adopt it? What would this look like? What would this feel like? What would it be when it comes to the specifics of my event needs? But as I said, that's certainly something, a conversation we'd love to have with some of you afterwards. And otherwise, I will open things up to questions.
Thanks for that, Tal. Now, at the moment, we actually haven't got any questions. I think everyone's still coming to grips.
Yeah, there's that. I wouldn't be that surprised. There's a lot of things coming that would be to pull apart. I think usually, though, I would say that most people will usually have questions to do with apps. The other part usually to do with some of the I don't know, perhaps some of the details or challenges or what the real benefit is. Usually, a lot of questions I find will usually surround why I would adopt certain pieces of tech when, I've been doing this, let's say, for 10 years, and this is the way I've done it, and this is a great great results of whatever it might be. You know, this is usually it's usually fairly straightforward challenges. And just so people do know as well, I'm more than willing to take challenging questions. I have thick skin, and even if you're a bit skeptical of the value or of whether or not something's productive or whether or not it's going to work for you, or if you think you're too small or too large, whatever it is, certainly more than happy to answer those questions.
Excellent. Well, they have started flooding in, so maybe we'll get started here. The first
Okay.
question I've got actually is, does the system enable you to house your risk management and registers for health and safety?
Interesting. So it's always going to depend on the tech. So I don't want to talk on behalf of, you know, obviously the entire globe, essentially. But it certainly, it's always going to depend on the kind of risk and safety you're tackling, right? So to some degree, we're talking about the event management, the interaction with attendees. And the biggest thing I would say there is that's probably a good example of something where a lot of the time people currently don't ask the right questions at the right times. So what I mean is that, yes, there's all kinds of health and safety, and of course there's a whole occupational health and safety that's a whole separate area. But for example, those permissions to use people's information and data, or to spread it or to not spread it, you know, essentially signing waivers and things like that. A lot of people are doing their other registration digitally, or just kind of confirming someone's attendance, and then that part they're doing on paper, which is kind of crazy because that's almost the information that you need to have on hand the fastest. And so certainly we have a lot of organizations that, let's say, that use Preevent, that might do things like agree to custom terms as part of their registration, even on site, some of those digital check-in systems. So ours actually allow people to actually sign to custom terms. They can actually sign on those iPads themselves and things like that. It's a very, very popular way of reaching some of those various compliance issues. So I guess on a wider scale, I'd say in terms of compliance with your attendees, yes. And then from there, it's always going to depend on the kind of tech that you're doing, you know, with some of those other details. Again, it's a whole area I could get into, and I might need some more specifics, but the short answer is, of course, it's always going to depend, but most certainly a lot of organizations use it for that purpose.
Excellent, thanks for that. Now I've got a few questions here which are actually around price, so I'll try and break through the common issues for you to address. So I've got
sure.
Someone here who's curious on what sort of price points they're looking at, which I guess they might be able to speak to you, but I've got a couple of other organizations here who have pointed out that their understanding is this software sounds great, but obviously it'd be a bit of a cost issue for them to budget for. So they've asked, are there any recommendations for a cheaper or more inexpensive way to take advantage of some of the software or this kind of software, or can they be more specific with maybe some of the apps that they'd like to use?
Yeah, so it's always going to depend. You know, obviously there's the classic conversation always is going to be with tech, that there's always some of that volume, that always when people are going to, let's say, agree to more years and all of that thing, you know, all of that stuff is going to go a long way. But the other part that I would say is that it's usually, I think, the price issue surrounds that we haven't sufficiently, I'm saying on all sides, whether or not it's us on the tech side or you as a planner, that often that problem is arising because we haven't dug in properly to what the value of the event is, what its purpose is, or what we're currently doing. So, I mean, a classic example is that so many people come along and say, well, my event is free, right? So I can't spend this tech because my event is free, except they, of course, hire people at tens of thousands of dollars and are often at a point where that person is already overworked, perhaps looking at hiring a second person. And so it's just funny. Of course, you do have many times where people are saying, well, I'm looking at hiring more people to cater for our growth in events. And yet the tech is expensive, even though the tech is going to be a fraction of expanding. Now, of course, you always need people, right? This certainly doesn't replace people by any means. But there's those side of things. Or people underestimate, people say, well, let's say badge printing might be very expensive, on-site badge printing. And yet they underestimate that, even small events, we're usually talking about, above 5 hours per event that's organized just for badging. We haven't talked about anything else. And then of course, larger events, it starts to become 60 hours and up of labor hours that people are putting in when it comes to organizing, like I said, just something like badging. And unless we're paying people far below what is legal, most of the time that usually turns out that we should be getting our experts in these fields, right? And I'm sure many people here are, in the event industry. This might be to do with sponsorship, whatever that is. Should probably be spending more of their time acquiring sponsors, acquiring attendees, things like that, as opposed to spending their time on those manual tasks. So that's not to say that therefore it's cheap as a result, but the point is that return on investment there? And if we can have our experts, our event experts, spending more time doing what their skills are worth their time, like I said, doing things like finding sponsors, improving the value of the event, as opposed to a lot of these other nitty-gritty parts which end up taking an individual hours, then I think that's where it starts to reevaluate how we approach this in the first place. Right? That's not to say, I do understand, of course. On the other hand, there are those that say, look, I don't have the initial investment to then get the return on, right? It depends on the organization. But that's about digging into those questions, those specifics. The other part that I'll say is an expansioner. So look, I've gone on for a bit. First summary is that there's a lot of value in these, and it's often worth seeing that properly, right? Rather than just saying this is treating it like a sunk cost that saves some time, right? Because that time can be used better somewhere else. The other part is that no one has to adopt all of this tech at once, right? So it might be that someone says, yeah, I need some registration and I'd like some badge printing one day, but I'm not ready for it yet. I haven't budgeted for that yet. That's fine. That's not a huge deal. On the other hand, you might have things like apps where people, these are huge values to sponsors. And so then it's really not really a question of cost at all. It's only a question of, well, what kind of real estate can we sell as a result of that? Or what kind of printing can we save as a result of that? Classic example is ACFID, Australian Council of International Development. They were pretty concerned about the pricing of this kind of tech. They happened to use the Preevent app and suddenly found that they could eliminate 14,000 pages of printing, and of course there were shipping costs associated. So they suddenly found that there was about 6K in printing and shipping costs they were saving by adopting an app. And so then the question of how much the tech costs in the first place was essentially irrelevant. But as we said, it's always going to be a case of having those proper conversations with these tech companies and digging into that.
Cool, thanks for that. I know the questions are continuing in, so we still got a few more on price or on our follow-ups, so I might just keep on that thread before coming back to some of the other good questions that everyone's got here. Makes sense. So I guess following up on pricing, there's another couple of questions that I think are relevant here. One of which is that, do any of these apps have multiple uses, such as, say, a staff communication platform as an example, so that obviously you could invest in some of this and then use that as a bit of a jumping off point for, I guess, another platform to use. The other follow-up question, which is a bit sideways, but is there any sort of, and I know that personally this can always get a bit interesting when you're quoting software, but someone's interested, is there even a ballpark figure you can give for some maybe standard configurations, just because they're curious, is it like a $5,000 investment theoretically, or 100,000? As one of our members has mentioned, they're an NFP with particularly small funds here, so they're just trying to get a very basic idea on what some of this functionality might be costing them.
Yeah, I think look, I would generally say, and look, it's very complex to get onto the specifics of price. I know that people kind of say, yes, of course I'm going to say that, but what I can say is it's usually because of the size and complexity and things like that, right? It obviously doesn't make sense, or at least my attitude would be, it doesn't make sense to charge a not-for-profit with a 100-person event or something the same thing that a 10,000-person trade show would be. They don't have the same needs, and so that changes things. On the other hand, if the tech is going to be worth your time, then you are going to ultimately be talking about the thousands rather than the hundreds. Doesn't mean that it has to be tens of thousands by any means, but again, always depends on the tech. Some can be just a few, some could be 3, 4, 5,000. Of course, there are those organizations out there that have very, very complex and large in complexity, and they certainly go up a lot more than that. But it's always going to depend on that. And the reason I say that that's the kind of price range you're talking about is, I would say, if you dig and if you do your research, there are people that can, and I'll be frank about it, there are those that can do a $100 app, right? Or even a free app. The reason why we're always careful about those is, first of all, if your app is free, like with anything that's free, you're not the customer, you are the product, and it definitely doesn't make sense to distribute the details of all of your attendees about everything and all of their contents and all of their everything they have entered and all of that behavior, all of that tech that I was talking about, right? All of that attendee tracking doesn't make sense to essentially sell it to a third company in return for getting an app, right? That doesn't, we don't think that makes a lot of sense. And depending on the organization, isn't compliant. The other part being that some of those other smaller apps, they often doing, let me put it like this. We have a lot of organizations that have come to us before and have said, and even to other organizations, I'm not just saying from my point of view, that have said, I went with a very cheap app because we wanted to save some money. It collapsed on the day because, of course it does. Unfortunately, you get what you pay for when it comes to tech. And so, we manage.
I think you've dropped out there, Tal. If you can still hear me, if you could just rejoin, that'd be fantastic. Apologies for that, ladies and gentlemen. We'll try and get Tal back on as soon as we can here.
Hi, sorry,
hey,
I'm here. I'm not sure what happened there.
No, that's all right.
Sorry, so what I was going to say is it's a very common, just so people are aware, and a word of warning, it's a very common story, is I guess what I was saying, is that people skip out, they try and save dollars early, or they try and say, well, let's start with something cheap and then try and graduate. And then in the long term, it creates a lot more problems. One, because it doesn't work on the day, which means you essentially throw the money away. So you didn't save money, you just threw more money away. You may as well have gone with something pay per schedule. And then the other part being that you teach your attendees that the tech is unreliable. It becomes an increasing challenge year on year when you use cheap stuff that fails, because then you get something new and better later that's going to actually work on the day. You'll find that they don't believe you. And I'm sure some people listening that would probably, if they've had that experience before, let's say as an attendee, they might be thinking that, and they might be thinking, I have those questions about reliability and things. It's because once you've had that happen to you once, you get burned, and it creates ongoing problems for you as an organization.
Awesome, thanks for that, Tal. Now I will follow up. Someone's got a good question here. So do any of these apps have uses or like use case scenarios outside of, I guess, the standard, I guess within the lens of Preevent, I guess from your perspective, uses? So like the app system that you'd be looking at developing, or any of the other things that you would budget through this event technology platforms in general, can you use them for things other than just event planning, or are they more restricted for that? I mean, the example that we've been given, so like, could you use a technology platform like this, say through Preevent, as a staff communication platform as well, or is it more geared more specifically just for planning events and managing those?
Yeah, so what I would say is that it's more the issue is that it's specialized, right? So no one's going to step in and tell you that you can't do that. And when you're familiar with these systems, I have certainly seen people in the past use them for things that you might say they weren't originally intended for. In fact, suddenly Preevent system has had all kinds of things that even we have suddenly realized other clients are using our system in a certain way. And so then we've essentially rounded off the corners in order to help facilitate that even more so. So at the same time, I don't want to say, yeah, you can do whatever you want. These things can do whatever you want. It's more about saying, well, what are these things specialized for? And sometimes there just comes a point where in the end, it might make more sense to make a presentation on PowerPoint as opposed to Word. That's the way I would do it, right? Each one does its own thing, specializes its own thing. Of course, the ideal situation is that you use two different systems that are specialized for one another and then integrate. But that by no means, I've seen, using the apps as an example, there's all kinds of interesting use cases I've seen. I've seen people use them for purely internal events. And so again, in many respects, they're essentially part of some kind of staffing type stuff. But as I said, it's always going to depend. The good thing is that a good app won't close or only run during the day of the event itself. So a lot of organizations use these as part of, pre-event certain information and even post-event certain information. And so as an extension of that, people at times use them for, as I said, creative reasons. But I would always at least recommend saying you should probably be familiar with the tech before you start gung-ho bending it to your will.
Cool. Thanks for that, Tal. I've got a question here, which hopefully is a bit more back to basics, actually. So we've got someone that's asking, where should their organization start if they're not using any event technology, full stop?
Yeah, fair enough. It's always going to depend on the organization. And I would probably say it's almost a question, it goes two ways, right? Because there comes a point where you don't use anything, where you almost don't know what you don't know. And a lot of people don't realize the kind of other solutions that are out there and the other kind of things that they're doing. But probably the best step is probably to start by saying, well, what is the purpose of my events, right? Why do I do them? How do I evaluate that this event goes well? Right. So what am I trying to bring in more money from the event? Am I trying to justify my existence by this event? Right. Because a lot of people put on the event in order to say, well, the event, the event in a sense is a sunk cost, but it's the thing that I put on in order to say, and this is why we get the funding that we do. Right. Whatever those things might be. And if you start there and kind of say, well, what is my event? How do I achieve my goals? Then we usually move from there of saying, well, in this case, actually, maybe, a lot of people would classically start with registration and something like that. But a lot of people actually realize, actually, the app is going to be the high value thing for me right now. That's the thing that's really going to get me up and running and started and get me most of what I need when it comes to my event goals. So that would almost be the question I'd start with. But it's never universal. And of course, by the way, a lot of organizations take everything at once. You don't have to take one baby step at a time. Of course, a lot do, but a lot realize that it's almost like the more you use, the more you get out of it kind of thing, especially when all of it works together. So then there's those questions as well. But as I said, it's always really going to depend on what your goals are. And I would say that when you're reaching out to having these conversations about event tech, it's probably good to have that those long-term strategic goals, as well as the basics of like, I want to save some time in mind. Because of course, we ourselves all come from these backgrounds as well. I personally, I didn't introduce this. I actually used to do trainings and workshops for like government and corporate clients and things like that. So, we've certainly come from backgrounds where we kind of understand the challenges that face people. And as a result of that, you'd always want to have a better understanding of the details of someone's event in order to do that.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Tal. Next question I've got here is a bit of an interesting one, which we've got a question asking, is GDPR important to consider at events, and how does event technology help manage that?
Someone, we might have I'm not sure if we have someone on the law side of things or some other kind of compliance. For those that don't know, GDPR is some of the new laws that have come in via the European Union to do with their privacy laws. They're very, very specific in terms of what they do. This is something that is quite an interesting area of itself, but the short summary of how it affects the majority of this kind of tech is that people, essentially, European citizens have the right to be forgotten. So this is, of course, coming around that you can't keep my data when I've told you, please, I no longer want you to host it. And that's a great example of why having an overarching platform is really important. So, of course, right, none of us are, or supposedly none of us are in Europe right now. Of course, a lot of us are dual citizens, things like that. I know our office, we have a couple from Europe, things like that. And this applies to everyone. And the fines are pretty hefty, right? They get up to 20, it's one of those like 20 million or 3% of your revenue, depending on whatever's higher. And it applies to you even if you're not in Europe. So it's pretty important that to be able to have good tech that's essentially be able to be compliant with those things. All those little things like cookie warnings when someone's on your website, all of those things, they do actually matter, and matter more than you think, and are the kind of thing that maybe perhaps doesn't matter until a problem comes along. You can almost treat it like an insurance kind of thing of saying, well, it's worth my time to make sure that I don't get into trouble down the road. Because of course, the alternative is that when you're doing everything manual, is someone can say, well, I want to be forgotten, but somewhere someone knows the information, right? It's still on an Excel spreadsheet somewhere. It's still on someone's computer, right? Because of course you constantly transfer this data between everyone all the time. So that's the idea being there, and the value and where a lot of event tech has been built for GDPR. I guess it's the short summary is that there's a lot of compliance that's coming around these days to do with data storage. You're less compliant when you're not using tech. When you're manual, you're far less compliant. You're not more compliant. And as a result, it often means that having a good system that's broad and covers all your bases rather than getting 12 different solutions is the easiest way to stay away from those areas. This is especially important for those of you that have international people coming, whether or not they're speakers or whether or not they're attendees. Any other questions?
Yeah, thanks for that. We've got one last question here, it looks like. So we've got one of our not-for-profits asking, is there a minimum number of events they should be organizing per year to make event tech worthwhile? For some organizations, it's a big change to switch to such an integrated system, and it may not be worth it. Or is it?
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's probably the biggest challenge that faces a lot of not-for-profits and things like that is their instinct is, well, I'm too small for this stuff. Right. I think that's probably that's probably the fair summary. There's always different ways, right? Not everyone's built for having, many events throughout the year, 100 events or whatever it is, and having all of that coordinate. Some of you have one event in a year, and it's very important to get it right. Things should at least always scale accordingly. I know we do, but so that's certainly something that you can do. And again, let's say from Preevent's point of view, there's huge parts of our platform that I haven't even begun to even touch on slight areas of that. But you'll find that most users of event tech aren't using everything that a company has to offer, right? Some are using 90%, some are using 50%, some are using 5%. So these things should at least always be scaling appropriate to your particular needs and number of events. Of course, generally when you're using things across a larger scale, there's a lot of benefits there. But at the same time, if you're putting on only one event, it's usually a sign that that event is really, really important. This is where I come back to the example of saying, yeah, this stuff isn't just for large corporations. I mean, quite frankly, the Fortune 100 don't need to put on their events. What I mean is they're not going to go out of business if they cancel a few of their events. For some of the organizations here, it's, in many cases, once we calculate everything, or even if you say, it's often if you don't do the event, it's basically a disaster, right? And it could even threaten the very existence of your organization. So it's almost a case of if you're not doing that many events, it's not always the case, right? But my point being that where you're not doing very many events or not very many at all, it's often a sign that it's really, really important. And as a result, often it's more essential to make sure that we get it right. Do you necessarily need if you're only doing one event, some of the more advanced integrations and things? Likely not, and many organizations don't use those kind of things. But do they need a good backbone, that if things grow in the future, they're able to build upon that? But probably more importantly, at least in the short term, is do they have the right tech in place to make sure that everything goes smoothly and sets them up for success, as opposed to simply setting themselves up to avoid failure. That's probably what most people do right now. They just try to avoid failure as opposed to even grow and do even better every time. Then that tech is always going to be used for all kinds of organizations. Just so people know, there are organizations that use where their event is nothing more than 100 people. They run it every second year, and it's a not-for-profit for, let's say, a local state in Australia. It's a very common story. This certainly stuff isn't just reserved for the big guns.
Awesome, thanks for that. Look, I think that ends the questions here. Are there any last words from you, Tal?
Yeah. So what I'd say is we definitely do want to hear from people. We'd love to chat to people. Again, I'm from Preevent. You can give us a call, reach out to us, however that is. And as I've mentioned earlier, we don't just have to show you things from a distance and say, I hope that looks really great. We'd always like to jump into the details about what your event are, because obviously a lot of you do have pricing questions. That comes with getting an understanding of what's actually involved and what some of the options might be for you. And at the same time, we'd always like to be able to even prove to you what's going. So we're happy to back ourselves in, essentially, and not just show you, as I said, some example websites or something like that and say, yours could look like this too. We are happy to, with no obligation, build out, based on your requirements and needs, versions of apps and versions of events so that you can either evaluate yourself or take internally that this is something that we should look at adopting and have a better reassurance and feeling that this stuff is actually specialized for you and not just a general thing that you have to jury rig. Stuff is very flexible. And so we want to be able to show that to you as well. We really enjoy working with our not-for-profits and do understand that often this is a big step for a lot of people. And so we're definitely there to help you every step of the way. So yeah, that's what I'd say. Definitely would like to hear from you.
Awesome, thanks for that, Tal. Well, look, thank you very much for presenting today, and thank you everyone for joining us. We hope you did learn quite a lot from this presentation. It was fantastic here. Look, if you've got any questions that come to mind later or feedback, please do send that through to events@connectingup.org, and we'll see if we can tackle that offline. Don't forget, again, the recording should be going up later this week, and that should include access to the slide deck as well. Again, look, thank you everyone for being with us. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you all next time. Have a great afternoon.